tongue flashed out for the third time in 5 minutes, aimed directly at the calm, unblinking face of Sergeant David Washington. The 11-year-old boy rocked back and forth in front of the Veterans Memorial, clearly bored by the solemn ceremony taking place around him. "Look, Dad," Tyler said loudly enough for dozens to hear. "This guy doesn't even blink. I bet he's not a real soldier. Probably just an actor pretending to stand still like a statue." Richard Morrison, a CEO of a billion-dollar tech company, barely looked up from his phone. His wife, Patricia, was too busy recording Instagram stories, joking to her followers about how dull military events were, events she only attended because her husband had made a big donation to a veterans foundation. Sergeant David Washington stood at full attention, his gaze fixed straight ahead. At 28, he had already served 3 tours overseas and earned multiple honors for courage and service. Today, he was part of the Honor Guard, a monthly ceremony dedicated to fallen soldiers. Tyler wandered closer, his designer sneakers brushing the trimmed grass near the barrier. "Hey, soldier," he called, drawing surprised looks from nearby visitors. "Can you even talk? Or do you just stand there like a robot?" He began pulling faces, sticking out his tongue again, while tourists whispered in disbelief. A veteran in a wheelchair clenched his fists, and an elderly woman shook her head. Through it all, David remained motionless, composed and focused. Years of training had prepared him for far tougher situations than a rude child testing boundaries. But this moment was different. This was home, sacred ground dedicated to his fallen comrades, and the lack of respect cut deeper than he expected. "Tyler, come here," Patricia finally called, still holding her phone. Her tone carried no authority, just impatience. The boy ignored her completely. Then in an instant that silenced the entire memorial, Tyler went too far. He stared right at David and shouted, "Hey, you look all fancy in that uniform. I bet you can't even fight. You're just here to pose for pictures." The laughter he expected never came. Instead, every face around him froze in disbelief. Patricia dropped her phone. Richard finally looked up. The veteran in the wheelchair began rolling closer, his expression unreadable. David didn't move a muscle. His years in service had taught him restraint, but inside something stirred. Not anger, something far more deliberate and powerful. He stood tall, embodying every lesson discipline had taught him. And though no one knew it yet, that single moment, one child's careless taunt, would become a story people would remember long after the ceremony ended. What followed would transform that sunny Sunday into a powerful reminder of respect, empathy, and the real meaning of honor. If this story touched you, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what happened next. How one act of disrespect turned into a life-changing lesson for an entire family. Richard Morrison's concern was purely for appearances, not for the disrespect that had just unfolded before everyone's eyes. Sergeant David Washington stood perfectly still, but his gaze now followed the boy's every movement. Years of service in Afghanistan had taught him to separate real danger from childish provocation. Tyler Morrison was no threat, just a spoiled child who had never faced true consequences. What Tyler didn't realize was that the man he was mocking had once served in elite units, led rescue missions that saved countless lives, and earned 3 medals for outstanding bravery. David had faced trained soldiers in war zones who showed him more respect than this boy ever had. "Hey, soldier boy," Tyler shouted, stepping even closer to the rope barrier. "My dad pays your taxes, so that means you work for us. How about getting me a soda?" Nakatitkam. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A decorated veteran in a wheelchair began rolling toward the scene, his medals catching the sunlight. "Son," he said, his voice steady but firm, "you have no idea who you're talking to." Tyler turned his head with disdain. "Oh, another old man with a speech. You probably lost your battles anyway." Then something subtle happened. David, still standing at attention, shifted his eyes slightly to the left. A man in a dark suit standing quietly nearby returned the glance and gave the faintest nod before speaking softly into a small earpiece. Patricia Morrison finally tried to intervene. "Tyler, that's enough. Let's go." But her voice carried no strength. She sounded like someone who had long ago stopped trying to guide her own child. "I'm not leaving," Tyler said defiantly, folding his arms. "Let's see if this so-called soldier can actually make me move." He began to imitate David's rigid stance, marching in exaggerated steps and making ridiculous sounds, turning the solemn ceremony into a mockery. Several visitors began recording, not out of admiration, but pure disbelief. Through it all, David stayed silent, his composure unshaken. Every word, every gesture, every second of humiliation was being stored carefully in his mind. Years of training had taught him the art of strategic patience. Sometimes the most powerful response isn't immediate. It's perfectly timed. The man in the dark suit continued speaking into his earpiece. David knew exactly whom he was contacting, because Sergeant Washington wasn't just a decorated veteran. He was a West Point graduate, an expert in human behavior under stress, and the son of two of the most respected figures in Washington, D.C. His father, Colonel James Washington, advised members of Congress. His mother, Dr. Angela Washington, was a nationally known civil rights attorney, and David himself had influence far beyond what anyone at that memorial could imagine. "Mom, look at him." Tyler laughed, his voice rising. "He won't even move. I bet if I threw something, he'd still stand there like a statue." Each new insult only strengthened something inside David, a quiet resolve, forged not in anger, but in discipline. What that privileged family failed to see was that every act of mockery was slowly writing their own lesson, one they would never forget. The man in the suit ended his call and began walking toward the commotion. Tyler, still showing off, clutched his chest dramatically and cried, "Oh no, he's staring at me. He's scaring me, Mom." Patricia immediately joined the performance. "Excuse me," she shouted. "That guard is intimidating my son. This is unacceptable. Someone will hear about this." Yet David Washington didn't so much as blink. His stillness carried more strength than any outburst could. Every insult, every false accusation was being carefully noted in his mind. Because he knew one thing. The most decisive battles aren't fought with fists or weapons. They're won with clarity, intelligence, and the quiet power of truth. The man in the dark suit finally stepped forward, showing a discreet but unmistakably official badge. "Agent Johnson, Presidential Protection Service," he said calmly. "I need to speak with you about your son's behavior." For the first time, Richard Morrison lowered his phone. His face lost all color as he realized the situation had just escalated to a level that even his wealth might not fix. "Secret Service? That's absurd," he protested weakly. "My son's just fooling around." "Sir," Agent Johnson replied with calm authority, "your son is disrupting an official military ceremony and making highly offensive remarks toward a decorated service member. This is considered a public disturbance and could carry serious legal consequences." Tyler, who had always felt untouchable under his parents' protection, suddenly hesitated. But instead of backing down, his arrogance pushed him further toward the edge. "Legal consequences?" Tyler laughed. "For talking to a soldier? You people are insane. My dad knows everyone in this state. You can't touch me." The silence that followed was heavier than before. The air itself seemed to tighten. Even the birds had stopped chirping. David Washington, still at attention, allowed the faintest trace of a smile to form. Tyler Morrison had just crossed the line David had been waiting for. Because what the Morrisons didn't know was that Agent Johnson wasn't there by coincidence. This ceremony was special. It honored the memory of soldiers who had fallen defending their own homeland. And Sergeant David Washington wasn't just a member of the Honor Guard. He was the hero who had led a rescue mission that freed 12 hostages from a domestic terror group in Montana. He was personally awarded by the President of the United States only 6 months earlier. He was also the son of Colonel James Washington, a senior advisor to the Pentagon, and Dr. Angela Washington, one of the most respected human rights attorneys in the nation. And like every soldier on duty that day, David's uniform contained a small recording device standard issue, capturing every word spoken near the memorial for security purposes. Agent Johnson turned toward the boy, his expression firm but calm. "Young man," he said, "you have just made a public statement that falls under federal investigation for targeted harassment during an official event. That changes the entire nature of this situation." Patricia Morrison stepped forward, panic rising in her voice. "He's only 11. This is ridiculous." "Ma'am," Agent Johnson said evenly, "respect and decency are not determined by age. Your son's behavior reflects lessons he has learned, lessons about power and privilege. And today, he's learning that those lessons have consequences. Meanwhile, David Washington remained motionless. But there was something new in his stillness, a quiet confidence, the controlled precision of a strategist who had already calculated every outcome. Years of service had taught him that sometimes the most powerful victory comes not from reacting, but from waiting. A decorated veteran in a wheelchair rolled forward through the crowd. "Agent Johnson," he said firmly, "I'm retired Colonel Martinez. I served with Sergeant Washington's father. You'll have 15 veterans ready to testify to everything that just happened here." The net was closing fast, though Tyler still didn't understand how deeply he'd trapped himself. The same onlookers who once ignored his behavior were now recording every second. Their phones captured the full picture, the arrogance, the insults, and the calm dignity of the man he tried to humiliate. Inside his mind, David finally allowed a single thought he had held back through the entire ordeal. "You chose the wrong soldier to challenge, kid." What Tyler Morrison didn't realize was that his careless taunts had just become a public lesson in humility, one that no amount of money or influence could erase. And as murmurs spread through the crowd and cameras kept rolling, something extraordinary began to unfold. An unforgettable moment that would soon reach far beyond that quiet memorial, reshaping the lives of everyone involved. It wasn't just David Washington's sharp military mind at work anymore. It was the unwavering resolve in his eyes, the look of someone about to prove that true strength doesn't come from privilege or inheritance, but from honor earned through courage, sacrifice, and service. The turning point arrived when Agent Johnson's phone rang. His tone remained professional, but as he listened, his expression shifted from concern to quiet respect. "Understood, Colonel Washington," he said finally, glancing toward David with newfound reverence. "Yes, sir. Your son is perfectly fine. We'll proceed as instructed." For the first time that day, Tyler Morrison stopped smirking. Something had clearly changed. Patricia and Richard exchanged uneasy glances. Their instincts told them they were no longer in control. "Mr. and Mrs. Morrison," Agent Johnson said as he holstered his phone and straightened his posture, "I've just spoken with Colonel James Washington, senior advisor to the Pentagon, and father of Sergeant Washington. He and Dr. Angela Washington, one of the nation's leading civil rights attorneys, are already on their way here." The color drained from Richard's face. As a powerful tech executive, he instantly recognized the gravity of those names, and that this was a kind of power no amount of money could influence. For the first time, Sergeant David Washington turned and faced the boy directly. When he spoke, his voice carried both the authority of a soldier and the measured confidence of a scholar. "Young Mr. Morrison," David began, his calm, precise diction cutting through the silence, "you've just committed a serious federal offense, but more importantly, you've made a choice, one that will follow you for the rest of your life." Tyler tried to respond, but his voice trembled. You can't do anything to me. My dad's rich. We know people." David allowed himself a small, patient smile, not mocking, but the kind of smile a teacher gives before delivering a hard truth. "Tyler," he said, unclipping a small recording device from his uniform, "in the military, we're trained to pay attention, especially when people believe there are no consequences. Every word you said here today, every insult, every attempt to humiliate, it's all been recorded by this standard security device." Patricia gasped quietly. As a seasoned socialite, she instantly understood what public exposure of her son's behavior could mean for their family's reputation. But David wasn't finished. His tone remained calm, professional, and unshakably firm. "When someone disrupts an official military ceremony with offensive remarks or intimidation," he continued, "it becomes a federal issue under multiple jurisdictions." Agent Johnson gave a short nod. "That includes disruption of a government ceremony, targeted harassment on federal grounds, and intimidation of an active service member," he confirmed evenly. Richard Morrison, now desperate, pulled out his phone. "I'm calling my lawyer. This is ridiculous. You're harassing an innocent family." "Please do," David replied coolly. "While you're on that call, you might also mention that I hold a degree in psychology from West Point, specializing in behavioral education and conflict resolution." I've worked on numerous programs to reform patterns of toxic privilege in youth. This might become one of them. At that, Tyler's confidence cracked. For the first time, he realized he hadn't been facing just another soldier, but a man whose experience, intellect, and integrity formed a wall his arrogance could never break. Then the crowd parted. Two distinguished figures approached. Colonel James Washington, even out of uniform, carried an air of command that made Agent Johnson instinctively straighten to attention. Beside him walked Dr. Angela Washington, her calm expression framed by quiet determination and a leather briefcase that seemed to hold the weight of justice itself. "David," Colonel Washington said, placing a proud hand on his son's shoulder, "I've read the full report. You showed absolute composure and dignity in the face of open provocation. That's what true service looks like." The air around them grew still, a silence not of fear, but of awe. No one could yet imagine that what had begun as a boy's mockery was about to become a defining story, one that would echo far beyond that memorial and change the Morrison family's lives forever. Dr. Angela Washington studied the Morrison family with the calm precision of someone who had handled far more complex discrimination cases than this crude public display of arrogance. "Mr. and Mrs. Morrison," she said, her voice steady, seasoned by decades of courtroom experience. "I've just reviewed the recording my son provided. I'm afraid this situation will not simply disappear." Richard Morrison wiped the sweat from his forehead. "Look, we can settle this quietly. Maybe a generous donation, a private agreement?" "Mr. Morrison," Dr. Washington replied firmly, "trying to purchase silence in a federal investigation only adds a new problem to the existing one." Colonel James Washington then turned to the trembling boy. "Young man," he said, his voice deep but controlled, "you chose to insult my son, a man who risked his life for this country, who saved others in combat, and who earned his place through honor, not privilege." Tyler's composure collapsed. Tears filled his eyes, tears not of understanding, but of sudden fear. I didn't know," he stammered. "I didn't know he was important." The silence that followed was heavier than any lecture. David Washington looked at him with a mixture of compassion and conviction. "Tyler," he said softly, "you just revealed the core of the problem. You thought respect depended on status. But true respect isn't earned through wealth or titles. It's the foundation every person deserves." Just then, Agent Johnson's phone buzzed again. He listened briefly, then announced, "The national press has picked up the story. News crews are on their way." Patricia Morrison's voice rose in panic. "No, our faces can't be on television. Richard, do something." Dr. Washington's tone remained composed, almost surgical. "Mrs. Morrison, the recording is already under federal review. What matters now is whether you cooperate so your son can learn from this or resist and turn it into a battle you cannot win." Colonel Washington added quietly, "As a father, I sympathize with your concern, but as a man who has served this nation, I will not allow disrespect toward those who defend it to be dismissed as trivial." Tyler looked around desperately, but saw only solemn, disappointed faces. For the first time in his life, he realized that actions can have consequences no amount of money can erase. David Washington stepped closer. "You're 11, he said calmly. "That means you can still change. But real change only comes when we accept responsibility, not when others pay to erase it." Moments later, the first news van arrived. Cameras, microphones, and flashes filled the memorial grounds. The story of a privileged boy who publicly disrespected a decorated veteran was about to reach the entire nation. Tyler Morrison finally understood he had targeted the wrong person at the wrong moment. What began as mockery had become one of the most public lessons of his life. But would it lead to transformation or only shame? 6 months later, a gentle wind brushed the flags at the same memorial. This time, Sergeant David Washington stood at the podium as the keynote speaker for the annual Veterans Ceremony. Before thousands of attendees, he began. "6 months ago, an 11-year-old taught me something profound. The greatest battles aren't fought overseas. They're fought every day right here against ignorance, indifference, and the belief that some lives matter more than others." Applause rolled across the crowd. Among the listeners, far from the spotlight, sat Tyler Morrison beside his counselor. The past half year had been the hardest period of his young life. His family's reputation had collapsed. Investors had withdrawn from his father's company, forcing its sale. His mother's once glittering social circle had vanished overnight. And Tyler himself had spent months volunteering at rehabilitation centers for wounded veterans, listening to stories of courage, compassion, and sacrifice. Slowly, he began to understand the meaning of respect, something no classroom or luxury could ever teach. As the ceremony ended, David Washington glanced briefly toward the back row. Their eyes met for a second, no anger, only quiet recognition of a hard-earned lesson. Because sometimes the most powerful victories aren't about revenge. They're about transformation. I recently received a letter I'd like to share, David said, glancing toward Tyler in the audience. It's from someone who once caused me pain, but also gave me the chance to prove that education can be stronger than anger. He unfolded a 5-page letter and began to read. Sergeant Washington, I don't know if I deserve your forgiveness, but I finally understand what I did. I wasn't just disrespecting you. I was disrespecting every person who has ever served our country. I've learned that real heroes are people like you, those who protect others even when those others don't deserve it. As David's voice filled the air, Tyler wiped away quiet tears, not of fear this time, but of realization. For the first time, he truly understood the weight of his actions. David closed the letter gently. This taught me, he said, that our greatest victories aren't about defeating enemies. They're about turning them into allies. When the ceremony ended, Tyler approached hesitantly. Sergeant Washington, he said, voice trembling but sincere, thank you for not giving up on me when everyone else thought I was beyond help. David smiled and extended his hand. Tyler, he said, you've shown that no one is beyond redemption if they're willing to do the hard work of change. I'm proud of you. That handshake meant more than forgiveness. It symbolized transformation. Today, Major David Washington serves as a national consultant for military inclusion programs. His story has inspired thousands of young recruits and reminded millions that respect and dignity are the true measures of strength. Tyler Morrison, now a teenager, volunteers at veterans centers every weekend. He speaks at schools about empathy, gratitude, and the dangers of unchecked privilege. His family learned that real worth isn't measured by wealth, but by the respect earned through humility and action. The lasting lesson was never about revenge or humiliation. It was about turning injustice into education and anger into understanding. David Washington proved that true courage isn't just about winning battles. It's about transforming hearts. And sometimes the most unexpected heroes are those who once fell, but had the courage to rise and make things right.